Hello everybody, UB here, and today we're going to start a new series where I look back on projects that have had to be privated on the channel for one reason or another, usually editing mistakes, but they still deserve a place on this channel and a place where they get to inspire people to do crazy, weird art. So let's get started. Alright, so this first project I did was making props for a local escape room. It was my first time working with silicone or resin, both of which are not the most eco-friendly materials, but I'm glad that I had the opportunity to play with them because it gave me a basis as to when they really need to be used. The reason that I used them in this scenario was that the client very specifically asked for these potion bottles to be quote-unquote indestructible, which meant that they kind of had to be plastic rather than glass. So let's start by looking at the first half of this project. But I've been working on a very big project that had a lot of twists and turns, so it's gonna be multiple episodes, but with that being said, let's get started talking about how I sculpted, planned, and designed potion bottles. So I started with a bunch of different sized and shaped bottles that I found at Goodwill. For those of you who are creating on a budget, that can be a very good spot to start out with. The thing with this project was that these bottles were meant to be somewhat indestructible, at least some of them were. So as I was drawing them out, I knew that I was going to be sculpting on these actual glass bottles, but I also knew that some of them needed to be able to be cast into silicone later. Yeah, so the idea here was that some of these bottles were just going to be sitting on a shelf as part of a puzzle, and some of them needed to be handled. We were very specific in designating which ones were going to be handleable and which ones I just needed to make out of these glass bases. But I really like to start my projects off with a sketch ever since I read Every Tool is a Hammer by Mythbusters' Adam Savage. I really love that book. I want to reread it pretty soon because he really shaped a lot of the ways that I handle my creation process from now on, and this project was the first time that I really sat down and made sure I had sketches of everything I wanted to include in all of these bottles, and that was because of Adam Savage. And that way I could make resin versions of the different bottles so that they wouldn't break. Really, I started this project by finding the bottles at Goodwill, and then I went ahead and drew out some of the designs. I should have drawn out more of them so that I didn't feel so stuck, but I got what I got, and then I went in with some isopropyl alcohol and a Q-tip and some cotton balls, and I went in and... Always clean off your canvas. Always make sure it's clean no matter what you're working on. Just cleaned off the bottles because they were a little bit dirty and grimy and they needed it in some spots, and specific bottles were grimier than others, but this way the clay had some clean surface to stick to. After that, I went ahead and started sculpting. And sculpting these bottles actually took me a lot longer than intended. I started with the Frog's Breath potion bottle, and you'll notice that a lot of these are more potion ingredients, but it's a little bit of a mouthful to say potion ingredients bottle every time I want to talk about this project. So they are potion bottles for the time being. Frog's Breath and Deadly Nightshade were inspired by The Nightmare Before Christmas, and I started by making Frog's Breath because that bottle and the color of it and everything just kind of spoke to me. I do this with my projects nowadays too. If something about the project is just flowing in my brain, I'll just do that part first, do the easy part first. It might be counterintuitive to certain kinds of brains, but it is something that I found helpful in this project and a lot of the projects that were to come from this client as well. So I started by finding creative ways to cover up the insignias that were already on the bottle. So there was actually a little like apple on the top of the bottle there, which I covered up with a frog's face. And then I moved on to some filigree. And for those of you who aren't familiar, filigree is very ornate French decoration that really is a lot of small parts, and I did not nearly do it justice by the end of this project. I am very proud of the decorations I was able to do on these bottles, but yeah, I did not do the filigree justice, and now that I'm working on my line work and drawing, I have a better conceptualization in my head of what filigree actually entails. So hopefully we'll see better representations of that on the channel in the future, but I find it funny that I knew what I had done here. I had a lot to do. I had 12 bottles in total to create, and I tried to make it all flow together into itself. And this was the first project that I really worked with flow, so it's interesting that I'm talking about it here. I didn't do a great job with it because the other thing that was going into this project was trying to make the clay stick to the glass, which is very tough. I should have sanded the glass, not that I had the proper equipment to do so. That would be something where I would need the proper masking and PPE equipment, but this was actually when I was still living in my tiny little apartment, and part of the reason I took so long on these was that the clay was not sticking so well. So I did work with flow to an extent here because I had to with the filigree, but it really wasn't a part of this project. And in some bottles, such as this first one that you're watching me sculpt now for the snips, snails, and puppy dog tails. I forgot that I did snips and snails and puppy dog tails, but I love that for myself. For some of these, that didn't really work out. It turned out kind of chunky and gross, and I wasn't super happy with how it turned out. But you can see as I sculpt the other potion bottles, it slowly gets more and more ornate, and I really appreciate that that was a improvement that I could make. It still didn't turn out nearly the way I had it envisioned in my head. So the irony of the statements that I'm making here is that the client in this scenario had very specific ideas about what the potion bottles were supposed to look like because they had found something on Etsy that was just a little out of their price range, and they wanted something that was both indestructible and a little more reasonable price-wise. So that's where I came in, but I was never going to end up with that level of fidelity in what I created because I had a lot of different variables in this situation, from limits on the materials that I could use to the fact that I had never done a project like this before. So it really was kind of setting me up for failure, but looking back on this, I am so impressed with what I was actually able to put together by the end. But I think some of the imagery that I was able to put together was really cool and really important in the end. I kind of was trying to put my own spin on those same potion bottles, so we very much accomplished that. I was very, very excited when we finally got them done. I didn't film all of them being sculpted because there was a lot to do, but you can see one of the last potion bottles that I sculpted here being put together, being designed as I go. And while I do that, I want to talk about how this... I'm gonna tell you all about Sculpey in this old video, but now we are 3-4 years out from this, and I actually don't use Sculpey anymore. I know there's a lot of Sculpey super fans out there and polymer clay super fans out there because it's easy to just throw it in the oven and bake it, but I actually made a video all about the alternatives to polymer clay that don't need a kiln or an oven at all. So I hope that you'll go check that out because since this video, I have really found some materials that I think would work better here. Maybe not the paper clay, but I think porcelain clay would have done really well in this scenario. I used it in high school and that sort of thing because it's very, very useful for people who don't have a kiln because it is an oven bake clay. So you bake it at a very low temperature in your oven at home, and you try to keep it very, very thin, and it hardens around whatever you may be sculpting it on. whether that's a wire armature or a glass bottle like what I have here. And actually, these all turned out really well. The one thing that I learned while I was really putting these together is that if you use isopropyl alcohol on this Sculpey clay, this polymer clay, it breaks it down a little bit, and it's commonly used to smooth out sculptures. So you can either use it on a paintbrush and smooth some of your sculpture out, or you can take a little bit of the clay and some isopropyl alcohol, kind of mix it together and make a slurry. And that was largely how I helped the clay cling onto the glass here. That makes a lot of sense. I totally forgot that I was doing this. I don't know how safe that mixture is because it is a polymer-based clay. I don't know anything about the chemistry there. It might be totally fine. I find it fascinating that that was my solution at the time, because now I know I could have used porcelain clay and it would have kind of smoothed itself out. I could have done this in a lot less steps had I known that 3+ years ago. Now, if you're just making these at home, I would suggest you think about how you're going to clear coat them, because that clay is not going to play well with the glass over time. I personally ended up spray painting over this layer, so you'll see that in later videos. That basically held the Sculpey clay onto the glass, and it should be good for the next 2 to 3 years through the lifespan of this escape room. But if you're making... This is definitely a big point to make, is these weren't made to last forever, but they were made to be durable through 2 to 3 years, thereabouts. This room is probably on its way out. If you were to make these at home, I would almost just sculpt the bottle itself and then put your decorations on that sculpted bottle, because there's no way that those clay pieces have stayed on those bottles, aside from the fact that at the end, I think I dipped all of them in resin because I knew they weren't going to live very long otherwise. Decorations for at home, it might be a different story. Now, it's really important to keep in mind how you're going to be using these when you're putting them together. So if you make a really thick decoration, it's more likely to get broken off, whereas you can see on these later sculpts that I did that they're very flat against the bottle, and that means that they're less likely to get broken off. The same goes for very, very small pieces. If you have like a very, very small tendril coming off of that middle section, such as on the blood root here, you're more likely to have it break off than if you're doing thicker pieces like on the monk's hood. There's so many of these bottles, it's hard to keep up, but here you can see the snake's venom that I made, and I really thought that one turned out great. This is monk's hood, that is bloodroot, and I'm amazed at how good these bottles look when they're just base coated. I totally forgot where I was at this point in the project, and I'm just so proud of myself. Is that vain? Probably a little bit, but dang, I know I could do better now, but that was a really good place to start. The next 3 are snip snails and puppy dog tails, because that's what little boys are made of. You can see there aren't actually 3 there. The other one I put into a silicone mold. It's a long story, but you'll have to tune in next week to see what happened with that. But with that being said, those are the potion bottles that I designed. All right, so that was part 1. Let's go on to part 2 and see if there's anything more I have to say. Thank you so much for getting to the end of the video. Here's 1,000 experience points just for that. Thank you so much to my patrons, Mark, Nathaniel, Twyla, and Liam. You guys are rock stars. If you'd like to join them in helping make crazy projects like this come to life in the future, please go to patreon.com/ubdraws. If you can't join my Patreon, a like and subscribe is equally as important. Don't forget to drink some water. Thanks so much again, and have a great day. Peace.